The rain found every crack in the city and turned the night into something that looked like a confession. A taxi sped under a neon halo, its windshield streaked with water, and inside it, Ethan stared at the reflection of a man who had once believed his life would be simple. Love. A small apartment, a dream that fit into a laptop case. He closed his eyes for a moment and let that brief, stupid hope go. The words she'd said earlier that evening, like a verdict, still echoed in his head. I can't be with someone who can't promise me a future. He thought of the way she had smiled then, delicate and dismissive, and how that smile had felt like a blade. The taxi hummed through a city that didn't owe anyone anything. Ethan's phone buzzed with an email notification he didn't open. He watched the rain like it might reveal something important. It didn't. The city, indifferent, simply kept breathing. Ethan had been 32 when his world split along two lines: what he had and what he could become. He'd grown up in a modest apartment where ambition was a whispered promise between overtime paychecks. His father had taught him how to fix a leaky pipe. His mother taught him how to count pennies until they made $1. He learned early that pride and money were different things. One kept you honest, the other kept you comfortable. He carried both, but not enough of the second. He was not extraordinary by pedigree. He was ordinary by paper, exceptional by restless habit. He learned to code because it felt like building with bricks that could become bridges. He taught himself design, pitch decks, how to hold a room without shouting. He worked 3 jobs while laying the foundation of an idea that felt like a thin seed in winter. People called him naive. He called himself patient, and he loved her. Not the open, casual sort of affection that drifts with the tides. This was the kind of love that organized garbage bags at midnight. The kind that translated her sighs into roots to fix. She was Mira, sharp, warm, impossible to ignore. They had met at a small coffee shop where she'd laughed at his terrible espresso order and agreed to a second date because he'd fumbled a book onto her lap. They shared 2 summers and a string of ordinary Sundays. But when the word future threaded into their conversations, it came with expectations she was not willing to suspend. She wanted certainty. Ethan had only a plan. The night she left him, the night that would split his life into before and after, was painted with small cruelties. It wasn't a single event so much as the accumulation of them. The looks he received when they met her friends, the offhand comments about apartments, a wedding invitation she accepted with someone else's name already in mind. She didn't shout, she rarely raised her voice. The wound came from the cold arithmetic of decisions. Ethan, I can't wait anymore, she'd said, a simple sentence delivered like a verdict. I need to build a life now. I need someone who can give me that. Her eyes, usually so alive, softened as if she were offering charity. I can't gamble on your dream. He had offered the only thing he could, honesty. Give me time. Let me show you. She'd laughed. The laugh that once warmed him now used like a sentence to close a book. I don't want to be your project. She put a hand on his cheek like a final benediction and walked away before he could catch her, as if she had chosen air over him. The room held the echo of her shoes on the staircase long after she'd gone. Humiliation followed like a second storm. Into the same week came the job loss, an email that reduced years of effort into a sentence. We regret to inform you. The company had been downsizing, and Ethan, with his ambitious nights and chaotic mornings, was labeled non-essential. He walked out of the glass doors barefooted in dignity and stunned silence, a man who had once believed in institutions now learning their indifference. People told him to move on. Friends offered the usual consolations, drinks, distraction, sympathetic shrugs, but something lodged inside him that was not grief alone. It was a heat, a quiet ledger opening with his name on one side and the slights he'd endured on the other. It was the memory of Mira's hand on his cheek. It was the look of polite pity in strangers' eyes when he said he was between jobs. It wasn't all about her. It was about every small dismissal stacked into a mountain. He fell. Not dramatically. There were no melodramatic breakdowns, just a sequence of days where sleep came late and food was an afterthought. He sold the furniture that reminded him of their shared months. He moved into a smaller place that was merely a bed and a desk, the latter a shrine to ideas. The worst nights were those where he imagined her already sharing a future he had not yet built for himself. He cooked meals for one and placed 2 plates across the table, rehearsing scenarios where he explained himself and she listened. She never did. The turning point was not cinematic in the usual sense. There was no thunderclap, no sudden anthem. He sat one morning in an empty subway car, watching a businessman's reflection in the warped window. The man's suit was expensive, his watch older and worn with hard, useful scratches, someone who had earned every mark. Ethan, with his hoodie and calloused hands from late nights at cafes, felt a strange kinship with that reflected man. He realized he did not want pity. He wanted leverage. He wanted something that could never be dismissed with a kind word or a smile. He began to map his downfall as if it were a business plan. Humiliation could be a resource. Pain could be a ledger. He didn't want to hurt Mira for cruelty's sake. His vengeance would be different. He wanted to be undeniable. He wanted to build a life where the verdict she had given him would be irrelevant to his value. He wanted to become something so complete that the memory of rejection would transform into a footnote. He worked like a man possessed. It started with the fundamentals, sharpening his skills, networking differently, and swallowing pride. He began teaching at a local community center, coding classes for kids, because he'd learned that teaching clarified one's own ideas. He read books not for leisure but for construction. He watched competitors carefully, not to mimic them but to learn the seams. He took small contracts, delivered them with surgical precision, and used every penny to fuel the thing he really wanted, his startup idea, a software platform that solved an everyday inefficiency he'd noticed working in various jobs, the way small businesses mismanaged payments and communications. He saw a problem that felt like a bridge, clear, solvable, with a path across it. The early months were thin. He subsisted on instant noodles and late-night runs. Some nights he slept in the office because there was nothing left to do at home. The city, paradoxically, felt kinder when he was busy. Hours turned into code. He found him in the glow of monitors. Code became a language he used to talk back to the world. He found small victories. First a client who paid on time, then a glowing review, then a freelance contract that covered a month's rent. Each triumph was a small ignition, a confirmation that the world still had rules he could learn. He met collaborators when he needed them. Anna, a product designer with an appetite for risk. Malik, a marketer who spoke in metaphors. And Kira, an operations genius who could turn chaos into a spreadsheet. They came together in a cramped co-working space and believed, not blindly but with a kind of pragmatic faith Ethan worn into them. They formed a team bound by the same hunger to create something useful, beautiful, and profitable. Funding came slowly at first. Rejections piled up like weather, necessary, cold, but not fatal. Ethan learned how to pitch better, to read the room and tweak the story until it landed. He stopped making the mistake of angling his product as romance and started treating it as logic. The platform, smartly simplified, began to gain users. Small businesses loved it because it solved a problem that made their days easier. The network effect kicked in. A few angel investors, pragmatic rather than theatrical, saw the adoption and offered seed funding. The budget doubled, then tripled, and with it came a new set of challenges: growth, hiring, preserving culture amid pressure. Ethan's transformation was not merely accumulation of money. There was a physical change. He slept better, gained a sharpness in his jaw that only focused men have, and learned how to buy things wisely rather than impulsively. He worked out not to look good but to feel strong. He learned corporate diplomacy, how to say no in ways that built allies rather than enemies. He embraced discipline, structured days, scheduled risks, and routine that felt like armor. His relationship with Mira receded into the past, but never vanished. He watched sometimes through the wide, indifferent lens of the internet, as she climbed into the life she'd wanted. He saw wedding photos at first, carefully curated images that suggested stability and taste. They pricked at him, yes, but they also served as markers on his path. He didn't stalk. He simply observed from a distance and allowed her choices to underscore his resolve. Years moved forward like measured steps. The startup grew into something larger than a product. It became a platform that aggregated dozens of small services, each designed to help businesses manage payments, customer communications, and logistics. Investors stopped asking whether it could scale and started asking when it would IPO or be acquired. Ethan, who'd once been the boy who kept offering his heart, learned negotiations and term sheets. He signed his first major partnership in a boardroom with glass walls and a view of the river. that made him dizzy with the suddenness of it all. Success did not feel like a jazz hands moment. There were long nights of liability and lawsuits, of PR teams and difficult hiring decisions. But there were also breakthroughs, partnerships in foreign markets, offices that felt grown up, industry recognition that made his mother cry with joy on a cracked phone screen. The business grew into an empire of tools that made small owners' lives better, practical, useful things that generated revenue. And with that revenue came scale. When his company hit the billion-dollar valuation mark, the moment was strangely ordinary. There were toasts, emails, and a press release. His phone filled with messages from investors and people he'd once admired. He walked through the office that afternoon like a man emerging from a ritual, and felt the eyes of those who had watched him learn. He kept a calm face. The victory was less about numbers and more about the ledger he'd been balancing in his mind for years, proof that he had turned shame into fuel. The world is never the same at the top. New rules apply. With wealth came power, but Ethan wanted something cleaner than the spectacle of triumph. He wanted a righteous finish, a confrontation that would close the loop between the boy who had left his heart on a cafe table and the man who had rebuilt himself. He didn't want the cheap cruelty of humiliation. He wanted the dignity of presence. He wanted Mira to see what he had become and to understand in the marrow of her being that she had once chosen to leave a man who would not stay small. He planned a reunion not out of spite but because he wanted to tell his story with his chest bare. The stage would be a tech conference. Her industry, it turned out, intersected with the platforms he served, and his company was sponsoring a private dinner for industry leaders. He could have texted or called, but Ethan wanted it to be chance-edged with inevitability. He bought a ticket to the same conference where he knew she would be speaking. Not to ambush, but to allow fate a neat corridor to walk through. Weeks before the event, he practiced what he would say in neutral places, mirrors, in taxis, under the hum of the office air conditioning. He wrote nothing down. The goal was to be honest and measured. When the evening came, the venue shimmered, glass light and a crowd that knew how to laugh politely. Ethan wore a suit that fit like the skin of a man who had regained his dignity. He entered without fanfare, a quiet force in a sea of old money and new wealth. The dinner was contained and elegant. Ethan moved through it like a tide, greeting board members, paying his respects, making small talk. And then he saw her. Mira, seated at a table, luminous under the low light, a figure of who she had been and who she had become. Time did not rewind. It layered. She had the same eyes that had once been the map of his mornings. She wore a dress that spoke of careful decisions and measured taste. He watched her laugh with men who had certain kinds of power. She looked content, perhaps happily so. The sight made something settle in his chest. A sorrow for what had been, but not the crippling sorrow of old. Instead, there was a fierce, clean pride. When their eyes met, it was not cinematic at first. It was the awkward, real kind of glance two people give when they see a ghost. She looked at him, longer this time. Then a flash of something like recognition followed quickly by a composure that had been trained by years of choices. He moved toward her because he wanted to be seen. He did not want to shock. He wanted to be a man whose presence made an honest space. Ethan, she said, the name and old melody she had once known by heart. The syllables carried more than they needed to. There were no apologies in her voice, only curiosity smeared with a social cushion. Mira, he said. His voice was leveled, nothing theatrical. Around them, the dinner flowed like a river they were now stepping into. Conversation circled. He took the seat opposite her because it felt right to be face to face for the first time in years. They talked like adults who had learned to conserve their words. He asked about her work. She asked about his company. She was polite, not cold. He was direct, not vengeful. People nearby misread the exchange. Some assumed business banter. Others sensed a quiet tension in the proximity of two lives that once braided. Ethan listened as she recounted the last few years, carefully curated tales of success, a marriage that had not yet included the word forever, ambitions measured in houses and certainty. He felt nothing but a respect for the honesty in her tone. He had no desire to pry into why she had once walked away. When she asked about his journey, he did not answer with a tally. Instead, he told a short story about the nights he taught kids to code. About a client who had cried when his business could finally track invoices without drowning. About the people his company had helped. He spoke not to impress but to reveal what had become of his work life. The words he chose were not sharp. They were complete. She listened, and in the brief silence that followed, Ethan realized the moment did not need fireworks. It needed clarity. "You said once that you couldn't be with someone you couldn't bet on," she said softly, the same sentence she'd used as a reason to leave. There was no malice in her recollection, only a memory trying to align its edges. He considered the option of telling her how hollow that felt, of cataloging the nights it had hollowed him. Instead, he said, "I wasn't the man you wanted then. I'm not the same man now, that was all." The phrase carried years like distance folded into a line. She looked at him for a long time. There was something almost like an apology in her face, if apologies could be nonverbal. "I'm glad you found what you needed," she said. The words were simple. In them, Ethan heard both acceptance and a small, understandable pride. He had no interest in their meaning as absolution or punishment. He wanted only to exist in his own truth. Then, with a poised straightness that surprised him, he asked the question that had lived in him like a quiet brand. "Mira, why did you leave?" She swallowed, the movement soft as a curtain closing. "Because I was afraid," she said frankly, "of risk of losing what I thought I deserved. I chose security. I won what I wanted then." She did not look triumphal. She looked like a woman who had paid for her choices with the currency of compromise. Ethan felt no need to name the other feelings. Bitterness, wounded pride, the ache that had once made him smaller. Instead, he answered, "I made a different kind of bet. I bet on work, on craft, on days that felt like investments." He let the metaphor hang in the air, an acknowledgement that they had chosen different currencies. The conversation could have ended there in mutual politeness. But somewhere in the exchange a third presence entered, the founder who had introduced them, a mentor of sorts. He wanted to hear Ethan speak about strategy and product. Ethan obliged. He spoke with clarity about business ethics, about the responsibility of building a tool that affected livelihoods. He spoke about profit and purpose as if they were married terms. The crowd listened. It was not a spectacle of revenge. It was a demonstration of mastery. Later, as the night wound down and the city's rain thinned into a memory, Mira stood and crossed the room. She stopped in front of Ethan and held his gaze. Then, without dramatics, she said, "You look, well." It was the gentlest return of a compliment she might once have given freely. "You too," he replied. "There is a kind of closure in mutual recognition. It doesn't erase the past. It reclothes it in something that fits better." They parted that night with a handshake, simple and decisive. There was no gloat, no final cruelty. Ethan felt something settle into him like a long-delayed peace. The revenge he'd envisioned had never been a spectacle of humiliation. It had been a reclamation, of dignity, of autonomy, of the right to be the poet of one's own life. He had not sought to punish her for choosing differently. He had sought to prove a simpler truth, that human value does not hinge on someone else's approval. Months later, when the company's IPO was announced, newspapers carried profiles and business shows debated the implications. Interviews came with soft questions about his personal life. He answered with artful brevity, a line about hard work, a credit to his team. He did not exploit his past heartbreak for drama. He had learned that the loudness of victory is not measured by how loudly you shout it, but by how calmly you hold it. Mira's name appeared in a headline that was not about him. He felt nothing at first, only a human curiosity. He remembered the woman she had been, brave in some ways, fearful in others. He saw that both of them had paid different prices for their choices. Time, which had been both enemy and ally, continued. People changed. Ethan continued to build, to govern a company with a conscience he hoped would outlast him. He used his wealth to fund programs that trained young people from neighborhoods like the one he'd come from. He established a scholarship for students who wanted to build and not just dream. He found a way to turn his wound into a resource that helped others avoid the humiliation he had once known. At a private event months after the IPO, Mira approached him again. This time she was alone and without the careful armor of a spouse. She smiled, quieter now, older in a way that felt like weather. No drama followed. I made choices, she said simply. So did I, he replied. She paused, then with a softness that had come from a life well scrutinized, added, I'm sorry. Ethan had imagined many responses in the years he'd replayed their parting. None of them felt necessary now. He took a breath and let the past sit like a finished sentence. Thank you, he said. I hope you're happy, she smiled. I am. It was a true answer. For the first time in years, Ethan wanted for her what he truly desired for everyone. Contentment, whether with him or not. He walked away from that conversation into a night that felt empty in the best possible way. No drama, no proclamation, only the hum of life and the sound of his own steady footsteps. The city watched him as it always had, indifferent but rich with possibility. Revenge, he realized, had been a narrower thing in his mind than it was in life. He had believed it meant a single, exquisite moment of restitution. Instead, he learned it could be a long, patient architecture, brick by brick, plan by plan. He had used discipline instead of cruelty, work instead of spite. He had built a life so complete that the memory of being refused no longer had the power to shrink him. Years later, in a speech to his company, standing in a room where the lights reflected off polished surfaces and the audience watched like a small city, he spoke of failure and persistence. He told the story of nights where he'd sleep sketch ideas on napkins, of mentors who'd told him he had an unreasonably stubborn heart, and of people who had once refused him, but had also shown him the clarity of his own path. He did not name Mira. He did not declare victory. He simply said, if someone tells you no because they're afraid of betting, let them keep their fear. Build your work. Let it be your answer. The room listened because they had lived similar truths. Students, entrepreneurs, those who had felt the sting of dismissal. He left the stage to applause that was warm and unartificial. He had won in the only way he'd ever known how, by becoming someone who made a difference and by allowing his life to be the statement. And somewhere in a quieter corner of the world, Mira folded her own life into a narrative that had both gains and losses. They had been young once, and those years had taught them both something essential. The currency of life is not just money, nor is it only love. It is the sum of choices, kept or spent with integrity. She would remember Ethan as the man who had loved with fervor and then built himself whole. That memory would not feel like a wound. It would be a page in her life's ledger. Ethan watched the sunset from the roof of a building that had once seemed unreachable. The air smelled of salt and possibility. He thought of the boy who'd counted pennies with his mother, the man who had learned how to code in the glow of a borrowed monitor, and the nights he'd gone without for a dream that people called foolish. He thought of pain, the kind that seared and the kind that taught, and how both had made him careful and kind in ways he hadn't anticipated. He never forgot the sting of rejection. That small crucible had been the forge. He used it to temper his work, and in the heat of it he'd found something else. The ability to let people go without hating them, to build rather than destroy, to turn spite into focus. He learned that the grandest revenge was not the public denouement he'd once imagined, but the quiet that followed a life well lived, the peace in knowing he had not wasted his pain. The city spread below him, a lattice of stories. The rain had stopped. The streets glimmered. Ethan sat alone on the rooftop, his silhouette against a sky rinsed clean, and smiled not because he had won over someone else, but because he had kept to himself the single truth that mattered. He had built a life that no one could take from him again. He rose, walked down the stairs and vanished into the city, a quiet man with a steady heart and a world that finally made sense.